Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Martin Andrews, and you are here for today's webinar, Tools for Identifying High-Quality Social Studies Instruction. The webinar is brought to you by the National Council for the Social Studies. How many of you out there joining us today attended the conference just last week? I think this time last week, we were loading in and getting ready for it. Who was there last week at the National Council for the Social Studies National Conference? It was a great time. We had a wonderful time in Nashville, so many wonderful sessions. Patricia was there. She just said in the chat, it was a really great experience. And as you know, the National Council for the Social Studies brings together social studies teachers, instructional leaders, thought leaders from all over the country. And one of the ways that you can share your knowledge with NCSS is by submitting for its publications, year-round online learning programs and publications. Write or present with NCS by sharing with them. Why don't you go to socialstudies.org to find out how you can do that. The webinar is also brought to you by inquirED. inquirED has created Inquiry Journeys, our K-5 elementary social studies curriculum, to bring teaching and learning in elementary social studies beyond the textbook. And you could find out yourself because we offer free pilots for schools and districts where you can experience a free pilot of Inquiry Journeys, engage in the professional learning offerings that we provide as part of our curriculum before or during an adoption process. You can go to that, scan that QR code if you're interested, or follow up with me and I can let you know more information about that. So now I would actually like to bring on our two panelists today. We're going to be joined by Elisabeth Ventling Simon, the Chief Academic Officer and co-founder of inquirED, and Sarah Milo Hoskow, the Head of Partner Experience. Hey, Elisabeth and Sarah, thanks so much for joining me today. So we're talking about teaching practices, and I think, Sarah, you're going to start us off. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd love to start us off thinking about teaching practices. And so, Martin, if you don't mind going to the next slide for me, I wanted to ground this discussion in teaching practices in the social studies. While we actually truly believe the inquiry-based teaching practices we're going to think about today can support and underpin any discipline, we know that they're really important to rigorous and inquiry-based social studies. So we know that if we want students to engage in inquiries that are sustained and through which they build knowledge over time, we need our inquiry-based teaching practices in place. We know that if we want the teacher to find themselves as this facilitator guiding student-centered instruction, these teaching practices are really important. So these are the qualities that we find in rigorous and inquiry-based social studies, and we know that the teaching practices we're going to talk about underpin this. So they're really relevant to the discipline that bring us all together today around social studies.
Great.
So when we think of our teaching practices, I think there can be a tendency to just think of a teaching practice as what teachers do, but we like to think about when you see the teaching practices in place, that will guide or lead to certain things showing up, or they'll elicit the classroom environment that is rigorous and inquiry-based. It will also show up in what the teacher is doing, the teacher actions. And when a teacher is engaging in these teaching practices, that's also when we see what the students are doing, the student actions that are rooted in these sustained investigations where students are at the center of the learning as they're building deep knowledge.
So is it that the teacher has sort of not only their focus is on what they're doing, but their practice is transforming the environment or building the environment or supporting the environment, and also obviously affecting what the students are doing?
Absolutely. It's all around how they're setting up the learning and how they're guiding the students through that learning. So it's not just themselves, but what they're bringing forth in the students and the environment.
Whew, that's a lot of stuff, Sarah, on that slide.
That is a lot of stuff, and we actually don't want everyone to feel like they have to read this whole slide, but we wanted to give you, this is what we call our overview of our teaching practices. In this list, you see what we expect to see in a rigorous inquiry-based social studies classroom. We know that teachers' practice is not automatic. It is something we work towards. So teachers are developing these over time. So one thing we like to do when we first introduce these to partner coaches or partner teachers, we know that it's a journey to develop your practice. So one thing we like to ask folks to do, and I'm going to ask the folks on the call to do this today, is to skim this. Don't spend too much time thinking about it, but skim these practices at this very high description level and see if you can identify one that seems for you like, oh, on the surface level, this feels familiar. Maybe something that's part of my practice, or if I'm a coach, it's part of the practice of the teachers I support. And see if you can identify one that feels a little more like a stretch for yourself or the folks you support, or if you're an administrator or a director of curriculum and instruction, just think of the educators in your space. What feels more like a stretch? And I would like to invite you to put just that one bold word, maybe familiar, dash that bold word, stretch, dash that bold word in the chat. And we're going to see if we have similarities among us, and we're going to see if there might be a range, but take a minute and go ahead and skim this and identify your familiar and stretch practice. Great. Thank you so much for sharing your immediate reactions to this.
I'm thinking too, Sarah, as I type in mine, it's almost like my stretch practices are things that maybe I do, but is the first thing that I leave behind sometimes, it's not part of it's the first thing that I like when I get overwhelmed or get busy or whatever, it's the thing that doesn't get carried along.
That's a great, yes, it's like not in there with muscle memory. Yeah, so you're not doing it automatically, perhaps.
Yep.
So I've seen a trend here, a bit of familiar, a lot of culture and collaboration being familiar. I'm seeing some stretch around investigation and authenticity. These are actually, that there's range here, but those trends are trends that we actually hear from the partner teachers that are using our Inquiry Journeys curriculum that we're supporting as they use that curriculum as well. I was actually, Martin, do you mind going back? I did want to say one thing. The component of design is really interesting. If you are a teacher not using a curriculum, that design falls entirely on you. I think if you are a teacher using a curriculum, there's a little bit of the art of finding your space in the design where it is, you're not designing from scratch, but you're really understanding your content, you're digging into it, you're internalizing lessons, and you're making sense of something that has come to you. So whether or not you're actually designing your curriculum, there is work in that practice for you to be doing.
I'd be curious just of the people out there who are practicing teachers, how many of you are cobblers, which is a term that I think somebody used in a webinar recently that we had on, you're cobbling together a curriculum. It's a little bit, you might have a text, you might have some books, you might have things that you found online. How many cobblers are out there? And those of you who are cobblers probably spend a lot of time searching for those materials too. Can I go on to the next one, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. So those high-level descriptions are just kind of a big bucket description of what this practice is. But like we said, the teaching practice will elicit things that are occurring in the classroom. This might be the classroom environment, it might be the teacher actions, and it might be the student actions. And so then we like to dig a little bit deeper into the practice by looking at what we call look-fors. So if this teaching practice is in place, you would see certain evidence of it. And these look fors are something that once we ask folks to look at the look fors associated with their familiar and stretch practice, we actually find that most people say, oh, in my stretch practice, there are actually things that I'm already doing here and I have something to build from. And in my familiar practice, when I look at the look fors, I actually have areas where I can still grow. And I think that's really important. Developing your teaching practice is not static. We all have, even within the practices, we have strengths and areas for growth. And these look fors are not exhaustive. It's not the whole list of what you would see if this teaching practice is in place, but they're helpful indicators for knowing, is this practice being developed? Is it in action in one way or another? And also, like you said, Martin, when you're in a growth zone, when you're on the path of development, it is likely that you will see these look fors when the environment is right, and under like stressful or rushed circumstances, maybe some of these look fors move to the background. So really thinking of it as, for teachers, just like their students, it is about development and growth, and everyone is somewhere on the growth continuum. And this is just to indicate here that this is really common for us to see when we're talking to educators who are supporting, that collaboration is often one of the familiar look for, or the familiar practices. But when teachers get a little bit closer to it, they realize like, oh, highlighting in red, this is an area that I could still grow, but the green, this is something I already do in my classroom on a regular basis. Investigation often is one that we find teachers are considering more of a stretch zone. And again, there are familiar practices within that and growth areas within that as well. So I would like to invite our participants on this webinar to have a copy of inquirED's inquiry-based teaching practices handy for the remainder of this webinar. And so you can head over to this URL, and it's going to take you to our Inquiry Hub. So the Inquiry Hub is a professional learning space that inquirED provides. It's used by our partner schools and districts, but there's a lot you can access there without having a subscription to our curriculum. There's a lot in Inquiry Hub, but for the purpose of the webinar, we've asked that you stay in the space of this, the inquirED teaching practices and look fors. But afterwards, feel free to pop around, look around, see if there's anything else that might be helpful to you in your work.
So they'll get a full list of all the teaching practices that were on that. Are the look fors on that page as well?
Yes,
Sarah?
they should be getting the teaching practices with the bulleted look fors below.
Okay, and you would like them to have that open for the what's coming down the
Yeah, I'm going to hand it off to Elisabeth to talk about teaching practice in action, and I think there are going to be opportunities to take a look at those teaching practices and look fors.
Awesome. Oh, you're muted, Elisabeth. You are still muted.
I'm having some technical challenges.
There you go. I can hear you perfectly.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So a little bit of context before we dive in. I wanted to pull up a few learning experiences that would allow us to see how different teaching practices might be present through different areas of instruction. But a little context before we do that, it's important to understand, especially since design is one of our teaching practices, that we're looking at a really small slice of instruction, just a snapshot within a larger inquiry unit. So in our curriculum, the structure frames each unit with a large, compelling inquiry question that launches with a hook activity that engages students in the investigation, gets them generating their own questions, and sparks their curiosity, moves them through a sustained investigation over the course of several modules, and then culminates when students use their knowledge to take an informed action that has an impact on the world. So we're going to zoom in on just a few learning experiences in a sequence across the course of just a couple of lessons. So very, very small snapshot view here. And these lessons come from the unit Natural Resources of the United States. And in this module, which is in the middle of that larger inquiry, students are learning about the ways that the environment, the economy, and human well-being interact through an investigation of the Dust Bowl. And within those lessons, we're going to take a look at, again, an instructional snapshot of how teachers are initiating learning, how they're supporting students in building some foundational knowledge, and how they then help them apply and deepen their understanding and their depth of knowledge as well. So kicking off this module, the teacher's going to initiate the investigation. So introducing the concept or the phenomenon to make meaning of the essential question, establishing context and relevance. Why do we care about the Dust Bowl? How will this help us learn about natural resources and the interaction of these systems? And take stock of prior knowledge, which in this case, the teacher's doing by facilitating a see, think, wonder. So what observations can the students make from this primary source historical photograph? What inferences might they make? How are they leveraging their prior knowledge to make those inferences, to make those predictions, and even to ask those questions? So would love to invite the audience members here to think, which of those teaching practices might you expect to see when the teacher is initiating an investigation?
So I have my teaching practices open now that I have the right link. So you want us to just pick one of those that we think might be used during this initiation, right?
Yeah, and it's not, there's no right answer and there's no single teaching practice. There are always a suite that teachers are leaning on, but just curious what jumps out at you. Thanks. I see lots of inspiration in the chat, investigation, collaboration. Thank you. Inspiration was the first that jumped out at me as well. So the teacher is really engaging students' focus and attention, preparing them to learn with the complex question and inviting their prior knowledge, their curiosities, which help to kind of anticipate the learning that's to come. Again, not the only practice, but that was the first that jumped out at me as well.
I want to jump in here with like a behind the scenes promotion for today is our last webinar in our series, but we're going to have a series with NCSS in the winter and spring, and it's all going to be about the science of building knowledge, and we're going to get into how the brain builds knowledge. And one of the important things that a couple of the people will have on, we're going to have Daniel Willingham on, professor from the University of Virginia, prolific author. We're going to have the head of neuroscience at the USC Department of Learning and Neuroscience and the Brain to come on and talk about emotion and knowledge building and memory. And all of them sort of agree that this important part of like inspiring, hooking, engaging, getting students to emotionally connect to the material is fundamental for knowledge building. So I'm going to put the plug out there. We'll email all of you about the series when we have it finalized, but it's going to be a great one next winter and spring. So
thanks, Martin. I'm glad you brought that up because I often think of inspiring students to learn as really centering students, centering them as investigators, respecting them and their capacity for agency and meaningful work. And all those things are true as well. But it is absolutely true that engaging the learner in capturing that focus and attention is the first thing that is most essential to learning. It can't even enter our brains if it's not engaging us. So next in this sequence of instruction, the teacher is going to facilitate some really foundational knowledge building. So establishing vocabulary and just really understanding what was the Dust Bowl. What were the economic, political, social, and environmental conditions and events that occurred? And they are engaging with an oral history, listening to an interview, watching a short documentary, animation, and just like gathering some basic evidence and making meaning. So would invite you again, when you're thinking about that kind of activity, what teaching practice or practices might you expect to see if you walked in on that moment of instruction?
Investigation for sure. So really the teaching practices, as people fill this in, like we're going to talk about, and share some tools for, I don't want to give too much away, Sarah, about what you're going to talk about next in terms of the tools that you can use. But I'm not going to see, Elisabeth, all these teaching practices in place when I go to a classroom for maybe a learning walk or an observation. Am I?
No, it would be impossible. When we think about every practice or every look for could not be present at the same time. And you can think about, what levers, if we have multiple levers on a dial, what are we pulling in this moment in order to facilitate this specific moment of instruction? And in the next moment, I need to lean on something else.
Yeah.
And some of that might be related to what students are doing, right? What stage we are in an investigation. Are we trying to spark and engage that curiosity, or are we trying to lead them to build some foundational understanding? And each of those moments require something different.
Yeah.
So the one that popped out at me was challenge. Not just that the task is challenging, but that the teacher is thinking about managing that challenge. And so scaffolding the learning, baseline foundational understanding that's going to prepare them to do rigorous work in the next lesson as well. And really thinking about how the teacher how the students are engaging in the appropriate amount of productive struggle as they're engaging with these sources, and they're facilitating that engagement with those sources as well.
Is that, I know when we talk about inquiry-based social studies, I think on that first slide, Sarah, that you put up, it referenced sustained investigation. And that seems to be a difference maybe than a more traditional mode of instruction in social studies, and that the inquiry-based social studies digs deeply into subjects. Does that make this teaching practice of challenge even more important when you're talking about a longer sustained investigation?
I don't know if it's more important, but it feels critically important. And I think it relates to design as well. So a curriculum might provide a source, it might provide questions, it might outline the activity, but the teacher is also thinking about their own students' readiness and what is the amount of scaffolding, where might they push for more independence, or where might they need to dial back and offer more support. And so they're thinking about that really complex matrix of the knowledge, the prior knowledge, the challenge ahead, what's yet to come, the assessment on the horizon. And so they're thinking about all of those things. And in a sustained investigation, we're tracking over such a long period of time and thinking about, what are we building toward?
Right. One of our participants said, I use investigation in class, but I admit to struggling with sustained investigation, like keeping it going.
Yeah.
Any advice, Sarah or Elisabeth, for someone who's like trying to keep that investigation going? Now you're muted, Sarah.
You're the one muted now.
I didn't want Elisabeth to feel bad. So I think there could be a lot of reasons why someone is struggling with sustained investigation. I think some of it can go all the way back to that design teaching practice of making sure that the learning experiences are cohesively designed so that they build upon each other. So when students are entering into something, they're going through it for a long period of time and they're getting to something more rigorous or more challenging, that they have sufficient background knowledge from the prior lessons to carry them through that, so that there's an appropriate balance of productive struggle, or that there's a appropriate cognitive load that the students are carrying. I think there are also other things that are related to just I kind of call it unit fatigue when you're shifting to these more rigorous long arcs of social studies investigation and a social studies unit. That could be just a transition for both the teacher and the student, and sticking with it and finding ways to make sure all the other amazing things teachers do, like finding joy, celebrating successes, those can help carry you through as you build up your stamina for sustained investigation. So I think really I would have a question of what is the challenge behind the sustained investigation? Because it could be so many things, but those are two things that come to mind.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Sarah. I think that sustaining energy and momentum is a challenge. It's a challenge for students. It's a long time to focus. It's a challenge for teachers to think about, how are we engaging students and making sure that it's challenging enough so that they can build upon their prior knowledge, and it feels like this isn't dragging on, but that it's challenging me as a learner. But it's also not so challenging that I'm feeling sort of like out here on my own. I've in my secondary spaces with teachers and as a teacher myself, seeing students maybe not having the readiness to have that independence, or just getting a little bit lost. And so thinking about those opportunities to come back, to connect, to take stock of learning, to celebrate that progress, and provide those opportunities, I think, for metacognition as well. What have we learned? What do we have yet to learn? What are we curious about now? What new questions do we have? And let's keep our eye on that big question. Are we closer to answering it? How are we thinking about it differently? And just having that constant connective tissue, I think, can be really helpful.
Elisabeth, you're making me think, if I can just stick on this for one more second, about the teaching practice of authenticity. So we really believe sustained investigation is motivated. Students are motivated to stick with it through an authentic investigation, that they know the work they're doing has meaning in the world. And so for us, a lot of that has to do with doing something at the end and taking action, but making sure that students see why this work and why this kind of sticking with it and maintaining through a long investigation is relevant to themselves and to the world.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I agree with that completely. So the third moment in this series of instruction, students are now ready to have some increasing independence, some more complex disciplinary thinking. So while in the previous lesson, they were really gathering information, what was the Dust Bowl, what were the events that occurred, what was the context, now they're exploring some details. They're adding nuance. They're classifying evidence. Is this environmental? Is this human well-being? Is this economic? And they're thinking about what is a contributing factor and what is an outcome, what is an impact, and cause and effect relationships is what they're grappling with here. They're reinforcing vocabulary, they're applying that understanding of the event, but now they're grappling together in small groups and thinking about what was the cause of what event. And of course, it's impossible to make a singular linear chain of cause and effect because there are multiple contributing factors, multiple impacts. And so that's part of the grapple as they're sort of debating what caused what. Is this a cause or is it an effect? Is it both? And they're engaging in significantly more complex thinking. So they're leveraging what they learned the day before, but they're also referencing the information in these timeline cards to cite the specific evidence that might help them make the case for this being a cause or this being an effect or both. So yeah, what teaching practices hop out at you if you're thinking about walking into the classroom during this moment of instruction?
It's funny that I see some that are just like there every time, Like I think I've written down collaboration every time, so there are ones that seem to be like a really fundamental practice that you just see recurring over and over again, and then maybe others that are more temporal, like where you are in the unit, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I also think it's important, and we can talk about this a little bit in where we're going in this webinar. Elisabeth, you said, what teaching practices do you think you'll see when you walk in? And I think there are many that you see. There are many teaching practices or look for as associated with teaching practices that you may not see in any moment because it's not necessarily an onstage practice. So there's under culture, there's teacher cultivates relationship with families to support learning and build understanding of students' lived experiences. That is an important thing that a teacher would be doing to build culture, but I won't see that in the moment of walking into any classroom necessarily, unless maybe a family member was invited in to support with this learning.
Yeah, thank you. I think that relates to the teaching practices that I pinged, which are investigation and collaboration. And of course, we can see investigation right there on the surface as students are grappling with evidence, they're debating, they're explaining their understanding, they're providing rationales to one another for why they might place a card here or there. And we can see that students are collaborating as they're working in groups. But what we should also notice here is that the teacher is doing less. The teacher is monitoring, circulating, facilitating, supporting, but the teacher is not guiding the task in the way that they might have been in the previous day or in the day before. Students are working much more independently now. So what has the teacher done behind the scenes to establish those collaborative routines, to build classroom culture that allows students to debate with one another in productive ways? How have they strategically grouped those students in ways that they know will be mutually supportive to one another within those groups? How have they connected to the design of the curriculum and thinking about what kind of challenge the students are ready for? Again, what kind of scaffolding might they need? What kind of additional supports might they need? And other things that we might connect to that aren't here. I was thinking of authenticity when you mentioned it, Sarah. And later in this module, they're connecting to modern day instances of drought and looking at the California drought and thinking about, could the Dust Bowl happen again? And no matter where you live, you have a context to economic, environmental, and human well-being systems and the ways that this historical case study has relevance in your world today. And so while they are not ready yet for that conclusion drawing, there are opportunities to think about, what are we learning here? How does this relate to our lives? And how might that come into the conversation that students are having right now in this moment?
And I want to say, as we move on to this tools and a path forward, I want to acknowledge a couple things that are that people have brought up in the chat. And I think it's good that I'm tossing this over to you, Sarah, because it's something that I think you and partner experience deal with a lot. So Kinsey said that she struggles because she doesn't control the pacing of the curriculum. And then Kirsten pointed out that that with social studies marginalized at the elementary level, the time is just not there to focus on some of these like deep core teaching practices. I guess you get that comment and question a lot, like, I don't have enough time, or the time isn't something that I have control over. If we're going to find a path forward, what is sort of a micro move that people can do, even if they're, and I don't know if you have an answer for this. I could be setting you up to not have an answer, but like, is there a micro move or a way to think about this on a smaller scale? If you only have 25 minutes for social studies, if you, I don't know, I want to put that out to you. And it could be just acknowledging that it's a struggle and saying that, yeah, it's hard.
It's a really real struggle. We hear it all the time. In my team at inquirED, we're primarily working with districts that have already chosen to use the Inquiry Journeys curriculum. So they've made an investment in inquiry-based social studies as a district, and still they're struggling to find the time. So this is in really committed districts to this, and still it's like, but there are still a limited number of instructional minutes in the day. And I think there are many ways, macro moves, that as a system, we need to think about a system of balancing time and integration, but we're here talking about practice. So what is the micro move? I love the way you phrase that. I think Elisabeth really helped us see that the teaching practice that is relevant in a lesson, while there might be a little bit of everything, there are teaching practices, and even if you go a level deeper, look fors that are related to the moment of learning, the goal of instruction. And so I often think about, what is the lesson objective? If I'm talking to a teacher who says, your lesson is designed for longer, but I've got 20 minutes. At first, I acknowledge 20 minutes is a really hard period of time to teach rigorous social studies. But secondly, what is the goal of the learning here? And what do you want to lean into for helping your students achieve that learning? And what might you leave behind? So if the goal of the learning is really about students having the opportunity to, in their investigation, communicate what they're thinking about using disciplinary vocabulary related to this topic, then I can think about, it's important that they're able to communicate with their peers on this, but I can use a shorter, perhaps, discussion protocol. Maybe I'm going to do a turn and talk, or think, pair, share, instead of a complex protocol that has students moving around the room and talking to different people. But if the learning objective is around perspective and really making sure students are hearing different perspectives on a topic, then maybe it's really important that I don't shorten that protocol and allow kids to move around the room and hear from different people. And I find a different time saving opportunity. So that's not easy. It's not simple, but it is more micro than creating more time in the master schedules in your district. So a little more in the teacher's locus of control. Still complex.
I'm glad you mentioned the system, Sarah, because of course, teachers have to work with what they can, and they're doing the best that they can. And teachers are on the front lines needing to, meet their students' needs. But we are constantly asking too much of teachers. And I would also really call on school leaders to think about how they are supporting teachers in doing the impossible. The standards for social studies are higher. Rigorous social studies demands more than a worksheet with matching or memorizing state capitals. It requires instruction. It requires that students build and apply knowledge in rigorous ways that apply that disciplinary thinking. And it doesn't happen in 20 minutes every other week. And so really, kudos to all the teachers who are grappling with this. And please continue to have that conversation with school leaders, with district leaders, and others who are part of the infrastructure, because it cannot be done by teachers alone. And shouldn't be.
Another thing that is something to think about is that these inquiry-based practices and inquiry-based learning doesn't only have to live in social studies. It can apply across disciplines. And as teachers and students build those muscles, things can move more smoothly. I really don't want to imply that anything's simple, but applying these practices across your day also could make your time more efficient in social studies. Yeah. As you and your students become more fluent in them. I'm going to shift us a little bit, and I think the idea of systems actually can be present in this conversation. We wanted to make sure folks left with some tools for reflection, from some tools to help themselves as educators or their school system, whether it's a school or a district, grow and develop in these practices. And so one of those tools you get to walk away with is your inquiry-based teaching practices and look-fors, but having those isn't enough. Opportunities to collaborate and reflect really can help us grow. And these are a number of modes that we see districts and schools and teachers engage in to create these structures and opportunities for reflection on where is our practice right now and where do we want it to go. I know that for many folks, when they see some of these practices or modes of reflection, sometimes, for example, learning walkthroughs, sometimes there's a feeling or an association with evaluation. And we believe that school systems do need to have a rigorous standard for teaching and learning, but that is not what we're proposing here. We are not proposing these as a mode of evaluation. We are really wanting to talk about lesson studies, learning walkthroughs, learning labs, classroom visitations as opportunities for development, for personal reflection, and developing practice. So we know that these are all things that are sometimes the terminology here is used interchangeably, like a learning walkthrough and a classroom visitation. We don't see these as the same thing. They are all unique in their structure, and even within them, there can be variation. But what we often hear requests for in our supportive school systems and teachers is learning walkthroughs and classroom visitations. And so I want to talk about what these are to us, how we see them, and the purpose they serve, and also allow you to walk away with some tools related to these that might support you if this is something you want to dig into. So the first thing, the first practice that we're going to talk about, I'm using the word practice while we're talking about teaching practices. That's not what I want to do. The first kind of protocol, we might say, that I'm going to talk about is learning walks. For us, a learning walk, the purpose of it is to really inform school or district-wide development, to take stock of where instruction is and where we'd like it to be. It's not about any one individual, but it's as a system, where would we like to push instruction for the best outcomes for our students? So it can be used for establishing goals, and really it's about having a holistic view. Oftentimes, educators of any role in the district can be a part of it, but we often hear about administrators and instructional leaders taking part of this to say for them to set goals of where do we want to be as a system. The idea is that you're collecting data and you're identifying both opportunities for growth, but areas of strength that you can build on. We are going to share our learning walkthrough tool. It's part of the suite of tools in the Inquiry Hub that you will also be able to access. One thing I really want to emphasize is when you're doing a learning walkthrough, you're seeing the on-stage practices and look-fors. So just because something can't be seen doesn't mean it's not being done. Also, to Elisabeth's point, really what you see is dependent on the moment of instruction. And there are certain things that will be present in some lessons and other practices that won't be present in other lessons. So that's why it's really good to think of this as like really high level balcony view, holistic data collection, because if you're popping in and out of classrooms, there's no guarantee of what you're going to see on any given day, but it's the collection of all of it together that can help identify trends that will help set goals.
Sarah, could you talk for 1 second too, when you get to as you talk about classroom visitation? I think there's a purpose, participants, goals. There's probably a process recommendation in here too, in terms of what should be happening before and after. I don't know if you talk about that with partners or not, but I just wanted to raise that.
We do. And I'm really glad you brought that up. And in the tool that people will walk away with, that will be outlined as well. So classroom visitations are we see them as serving a very different goal. Again, we're not thinking of these as evaluative at all. They're really about professional development of an individual. So the purpose of this is to facilitate a reflective, collaborative opportunity to reflect on instruction and give opportunities to think about how I might instruct in the future based on my reflection. We often see teachers and coaches participate in these, often instructional leaders, but I love these as a peer-to-peer, two teachers. From the beginning of my teaching experience, the first time I ever did one of these, it was with another teacher who was also developing in their practice. And that was a really great, safe way for me to reflect on my own teaching and to help my peer reflect on theirs. The goals is to really foster reflection and self-awareness. We know reflection is actually one of the teaching practices itself. To utilize constructive data collection and feedback about what's happening in the classroom, and based on goals, where do we want it to go? And to really give us opportunities to refine, like even as great teachers, we have opportunities based on our goals to tweak and refine our practice. The process, Martin, that you're talking about, is we really want this to be rooted in the teacher's own goals. So oftentimes we say, maybe it's starting with a teacher might have goals based on just thinking back on prior lessons and reflecting and thinking about what would I like to work on. But we think it's really helpful to root at that reflection in teaching practice. So okay, I hear you saying this, but what practice might that be? And then developing goals related to that practice. There can also be looking at the specific lesson that will be observed in advance to think about what are moments to strengthen that practice. Where might you lean in? What are some parts of this lesson that sound tricky? Can we think about troubleshooting in advance or instructional moves that we would like to use? So there's nothing gotcha about this. It's really rooted in goals. Observation with some opportunity for data collection of, if this practice were in place, what might I be seeing? And then collaborative reflection. We really think it's important for the two folks, if it's two peers, to come together and reflect together. Again, all in the service of professional development, achieving your own professional goals.
I also just want to ask people that are out there, the attendees, when I was a teacher, I never did anything like this. I never went with a peer to another teacher's classroom and observed, ever. And I don't know if that is common, but it's something that I never did. So I'm just curious if that practice of visiting classrooms is common in people's experience out there, because I can imagine, especially when I was a beginning teacher, how helpful that would have been to go with another person. Rachel says this would have been a game changer for my teaching practice. We did this all the time at the high school level where Kirsten worked. Especially not common since the serious sub shortage. Oh, that's true.
I think
Helen pointed out that, if you've got a shortage, you don't have the capacity to find someone to watch your classroom. Helen said our middle school started the practice last year. It's one of the policies I want to make common practice, Zach says. Yeah, I think that this could be a real game changer in a lot of cases. So we're going to open up for questions now, and I'm going to stop my screen share. But Kirsten said we do this with new teachers. We have mentors, mentees. So that's something Sarah said, not at all present at my last school. I actually left partly because I never received any sort of feedback. When we talk about there's a crisis, if you talk to instructional or district leaders, administrators, a crisis in teacher retention. And part of it is that it's so much work and it's such a solitary thing if you don't have opportunities to engage like this. So I just want to say, Sarah, that's a really, really great point, is that it's something that actually enriches your experience, feeds you, nourishes you as an educator to get to do something like that.
Can I just name that it's like a vulnerable thing? Whether it's your peer or it's your supervisor or whoever it is, it's very vulnerable to invite people into your instructional space because we are so committed to that. And so these things take culture building and trust, but the commitment to that can really pay off.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to open up for questions, and we've had a couple. That process question that you answered about the before and the after was really helpful to think about, like when you use these tools, how do you prepare and how do you debrief? For the teacher themselves, when they're thinking about that vulnerable moment, right? When someone's coming into their classroom, how would you coach Elisabeth or Sarah, that teacher who is having someone come in to do a learning walk or a visit, if they want to find benefit as well? Like if they want this to help improve their practice, how would you coach that teacher who is the one whose classroom is being visited?
I think the first thing that I would say is ensuring that what we're saying is true, that it is not evaluative, that this is not a place that we're not coming in to judge, and making sure that that is sincere, right? That we're coming in to learn from one another, that I'm, as the person who's opening my door, that I'm actually interested in, and not just welcoming that feedback, but it's something that I'm interested in. It's an area of growth that I'm, welcoming for my own benefit, and not to be on stage or to invite critique necessarily, especially if it's the first time I'm doing it. I'm going to be uncomfortable doing that. And so just really ensuring that what we're saying about the walkthrough experience is a true one.
I also think scoping what we're going to talk about before and after can be really helpful and comforting. So maybe your goal is to really make sure you're thinking about collaboration and you really want students to have opportunities to talk, to learn. That's the look for we're working on. And so it might like really having the observation and reflection be around that. Did you give students, were there opportunities? How many were there? Did, thinking about talking in advance about like what's ample time to discuss some of these prompts, looking at the lesson plan together. How long do you think this will take? But staying really scoped and focused. So there's no sense of like, I'm actually going to get feedback out of left field. I'm going to get feedback around my goal.
Yeah.
I don't want to open the huge can of worms of curriculum-based professional learning, right? But there's a lot of research that talks about when teachers are doing a learning walk or doing any kind of professional learning about the curriculum that they're actually implementing, that there is a really enhanced benefit to their practice. Sarah, maybe you could talk just a little bit about what happens when it's something that I'm also using in my classroom that I'm going to see.
That is I actually just attended a great session. It was actually about learning labs at NCSS. So a little shout out if anyone from that session or who facilitated that session showed up here. But it's the opportunity to truly collaborate and to understand. I think someone can give me feedback on these practices and look fors, but if they understand how it works with my curriculum and they understand the curriculum and they're using it too, then they understand the connection between the design of the learning. It's going way back to that first practice that if you're a cobbler or a writer of your own curriculum, you're responsible for that. And no one else really knows the complexity of what you designed. But if you have a shared curriculum, we have a shared understanding that the beginning is this initiate and what that's going to look like and what's the purpose of that lesson. And you may be doing it in first grade, but I'm doing it in fourth grade, but we still can come to agreement of that part of the learning. The purpose of that learning is to set the stage for knowledge building, to draw students in and open up their minds to the learning. So I think that when people are using the same resources and they understand the purpose behind those resources or the design behind them, it helps them dig into the practices in a different way when they're collaborating through either a learning walk or learning labs or classroom visitation.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Elisabeth, and thank you all for coming here today to talk about teaching practice. Look for an email from me that where you can request a certificate of attendance, and then also a follow-up email where we have a blog post for you that summarizes the webinar, a recording, and then we'll reshare all of those links to the teaching practices and the walkthrough tools. And please use those. We want those out in the world, and adapt them, use them in your classroom, and tell us how they went. So thank you so much, Sarah, for coming today, and thanks, Elisabeth.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Martin.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.